In court, my sister looked straight at the judge and said, "Finally, your house is mine." She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. Behind her, my parents started applauding, real applause, the kind you give when you think you've already won. I stood there silently, hands clenched, feeling every eye in the courtroom slide toward me. To them, I must have looked defeated. The quiet daughter, the one who always backs down. My sister smiled, like the ending was already written. What no one noticed was the judge's expression. She stopped flipping through the file. Her fingers froze on the page. Then she slowly lifted her head and looked directly at me. "Miss Carter," she said calmly, "before I rule on this case, I need to ask you something." That was the moment my sister's smile faltered, and the story they thought they knew began to unravel. My name is Hazel Carter, and long before we ever stepped into that courtroom, my family had already decided who I was allowed to be. Lauren, my older sister, was certainty in human form. She spoke loudly, laughed easily, and never doubted that she deserved more than everyone else in the room. My parents adored that about her. They called it confidence, ambition, leadership. When Lauren walked into a space, people adjusted around her. When I did, they barely noticed. At family gatherings, my father would place a proud hand on Lauren's shoulder and say, "This is our daughter Lauren. She knows what she wants." Then his eyes would drift to me, almost as an afterthought. "And this is Hazel. She's responsible." Responsible was the word they used when they couldn't find anything else to praise. I learned early that speaking up only made things worse. If Lauren interrupted me, my mother would say, "Let her finish, Hazel." If Lauren took something of mine, my father would shrug. "You don't really need it, do you?" And if I ever protested, even gently, the room would turn cold. "Why are you always so difficult?" they'd ask. So I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. Silence became my safest place. Years later, when my grandmother passed away, she left me her house on Cedar Lane. It wasn't a grand estate or a luxury property. It was an old, narrow house with creaking floors and a leaky roof. But it was solid, steady, just like her. And for reasons I never fully understood, she trusted me with it. Lauren laughed when she heard. "That place?" she said over dinner, swirling wine in her glass. "What are you going to do with it? Sell it and crawl back to Mom and Dad?" "I'm keeping it," I replied quietly. My parents exchanged a look. "That sounds like a lot for you to handle," my mother said. "Wouldn't it be smarter to let Lauren manage something like that?" There it was again. The assumption. That I couldn't. That I shouldn't. I renovated the house slowly, on my own terms. Nights after work, weekends spent scraping paint, learning, fixing mistakes. I paid for everything myself. Every receipt, every invoice, every hour of labor was mine. Lauren never visited. My parents never asked how it was going. But the moment the house was finished, the moment it became valuable, everything changed. Suddenly, there were questions, concerns, family discussions. Lauren called me one evening, her voice sweet in a way that made my stomach tighten. "You know," she said, "Mom and Dad feel like it's unfair that you have the house all to yourself." I held the phone in silence for a second before answering. "It was left to me, legally." She laughed softly. "We'll see." That was when I understood something important. To my family, I wasn't a person with rights. I was a placeholder, a temporary holder of things they believed belonged to someone else. And in their minds, that someone was always Lauren. 2 weeks after that phone call, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address, just my name typed neatly across the front. Inside were court documents. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, papers shaking in my hands as I read the words over and over, trying to make them make sense. Lauren Carter v. Hazel Carter. My sister's name printed above mine, separated by a single, brutal V. She was suing me for ownership of the house. According to the filing, I had verbally agreed to share the property with her and later withdrew consent due to emotional instability and external stress. It was written in calm, professional language, the kind that makes cruelty sound reasonable. My parents' names appeared on the last page. Witness statements. Signed. Not hesitant, not conditional. That hurt more than the lawsuit itself. I called my mother first. She answered on the second ring, already defensive. "Hazel, this doesn't have to be ugly," she said. Your sister just wants what's fair. What's fair? I asked quietly. She never touched that house. She never paid $1. My father took the phone from her. You're being selfish, he said flatly. Lauren has a family. She needs security. You're alone. Alone. As if that disqualified me from ownership. I earned that house, I replied. Grandma left it to me. She didn't know what she was doing, he snapped. And honestly, neither do you. The call ended there. The court date came quickly. Faster than I expected. As if everyone involved was eager to get it over with. To formalize something they had already decided was inevitable. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse alone. Lauren was already there, perfectly dressed, sitting between our parents like a queen between loyal guards. She smiled when she saw me, not a warm smile, but a sharp one. Don't worry, she whispered as I passed. This will be quick. I sat at the defendant's table by myself. No family behind me. No hands on my shoulders. Just an empty bench and the quiet understanding that I was no longer someone they were trying to reason with. I was someone they were trying to take from. When the judge entered and the courtroom rose to its feet, my heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to listen. Lauren's lawyer stood first. And with every word he spoke, I realized this wasn't just about the house anymore. They weren't trying to share it. They were trying to prove I didn't deserve it at all. Lauren's lawyer spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the ending was guaranteed. He didn't attack me directly at first. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he built a version of me piece by piece, calm words, concerned tone, sympathetic pauses. Miss Hazel Carter, he began, has faced significant emotional stress over the past few years. I stared straight ahead. He talked about my long work hours, about how I renovated the house alone, about how I chose not to involve my family in major decisions. He framed isolation as instability. At times, he continued, Miss Carter has expressed feeling overwhelmed, confused, uncertain about the future. Lauren nodded slowly, as if every word confirmed something tragic she had always known. My parents watched silently. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. It is our position that during this period, Miss Carter verbally agreed to share ownership of the Cedar Lane property with her sister, Lauren Carter, a promise she later retracted. A promise. That word echoed in my head. Promises are supposed to be mutual. Witnessed. Remembered. I had never made one. But the lawyer didn't need proof yet. He just needed doubt. He turned toward the judge. This is not a case of greed, Your Honor. It is a case of concern. Concern that Miss Carter, due to emotional strain, is no longer capable of managing such an asset alone. Capable. I could feel the weight of that word settle over the courtroom. A woman sitting quietly, accused of being incapable, while everyone waited to see if she would crack. Lauren finally spoke. She stood and faced the judge, her voice soft but steady. I love my sister, she said. That's why I'm here. She's always been fragile. I just want to protect her from making a mistake. Protect her. I almost laughed. Instead, I stayed silent. Lauren glanced at me, her eyes sharp. Hazel gets overwhelmed easily. She panics. She second-guesses herself. She even told me once she didn't know if she could handle the house. That part was true. I had said that late one night, exhausted, standing in the kitchen of a half-renovated house with paint on my hands and dust in my hair. But what I had meant was handle everything alone. What Lauren heard was opportunity. The lawyer leaned in. And that's when you offered to help? Lauren nodded. I offered to share the responsibility, to take some of the pressure off her. My mother shifted in her seat. She's always been the sensitive one, she added suddenly. Hazel takes things very personally. The judge looked up. Mrs. Carter, she said calmly, you'll have a chance to speak later. My mother fell silent. The courtroom felt smaller, warmer, like the air itself was pressing in. Every instinct in me screamed to defend myself, to explain, to correct every twisted sentence, but I didn't, because I understood something then. They weren't speaking to me, they were speaking about me, and the story they were telling wasn't meant for my ears. It was meant for the judge. Lauren sat back down, her role played perfectly. Concerned sister, responsible daughter, protector. She leaned toward me and whispered, so softly no one else could hear. See? You should have just let me handle it. I met her gaze for the first time since the hearing began, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't about whether I would lose the house. It was about whether I would let them decide who I was. So I stayed silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was waiting for the right moment to speak. The courtroom fell into a brief, uneasy silence, the kind that makes people shift in their seats, the kind that feels heavier than shouting. The judge lowered her gaze to the documents in front of her. She flipped through them slowly, one page at a time, as if she were no longer listening to the story being told out loud, but to something underneath it. Lauren's lawyer straightened, confident. My parents sat still, hands folded, expressions fixed. I kept my eyes forward, then the judge stopped turning pages. Her finger rested on a single paragraph. Her brow furrowed. She looked up not at Lauren, not at her lawyer, not at my parents, at me. "Miss Carter," she said evenly, "you've been very quiet." Every head in the room turned. Lauren smiled faintly, as if this were the moment she had been waiting for, the moment I would stumble, ramble, prove everything they had just said about me. The judge continued. "Before I consider the plaintiff's claims, I need clarity." She held up one document. "This alleged agreement to share ownership, when exactly was it made?" Lauren's lawyer answered quickly. "Approximately 1 year ago, Your Honor, during a private conversation between the sisters." The judge nodded, then turned back to me. "Miss Carter," she asked, "do you remember such a conversation?" I took a breath. "Yes," I said. Lauren's smile widened. The judge tilted her head slightly. "And do you remember agreeing to transfer ownership of your property?" "No," I replied. The word landed cleanly. Firm. No hesitation. Lauren's smile faltered just for a second. The judge didn't react immediately. She simply made a note. "You mentioned feeling overwhelmed at that time," the judge continued. "Can you explain what you meant by that?" I chose my words carefully. "I was overwhelmed by the renovation," I said. "By working full-time while restoring an old house alone. I was tired, not confused." Lauren shifted beside our parents. The judge looked back at the document. "And yet, this agreement states you were fully informed and acting with clarity." She tapped the page lightly. "Miss Carter," she said to Lauren, "you claim your sister asked you to share ownership. Why is there no mention of shared financial contribution?" Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it. Her lawyer stepped in. "The agreement was based on trust, Your Honor. Family understanding." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Trust," she repeated, "is rarely documented in this much detail." She flipped to another page. "And one more thing," she added, her voice calm but sharper now. "Miss Hazel Carter has submitted tax records, renovation permits, and insurance policies listing her as the sole responsible party, all dated after this alleged agreement." Lauren's leg began to bounce. The judge leaned back in her chair. "At this point," she said slowly, "I have questions about the credibility of the claim, not the defendant." The room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But something shifted, like a floorboard cracking beneath too much weight. Lauren glanced at me, her confidence visibly thinning. For the first time since the case began, she didn't look victorious. She looked uncertain. And I realized something then. Standing there under the judge's steady gaze, my silence hadn't made me weak. It had forced them to speak first, and in doing so, reveal far more than they intended. That was when my lawyer, Daniel Brooks, finally stood. He hadn't interrupted once. Not when my sister painted herself as my protector, not when my parents quietly agreed with her version of me. He waited until the room leaned in Lauren's direction, until everyone assumed the outcome was already tilting her way. Then he spoke. "Your Honor," Daniel said calmly, "with the court's permission, I'd like to address the so-called agreement." Lauren's lawyer nodded, unconcerned. Daniel approached the bench carrying a thin folder. Not thick, not dramatic, just precise. "This document," he continued, "is the foundation of the plaintiff's entire claim. Without it, there is no case." He placed the agreement on the table. The judge studied it again, more carefully this time. Daniel went on. "We requested an independent review of this document, not because we enjoy theatrics, but because something about it didn't align with the rest of the record." Lauren crossed her arms. My parents leaned forward. Daniel turned slightly, addressing the court, but his words were for everyone. "First, the financial inconsistency. The agreement claims shared ownership yet contains no provision for shared costs. No renovation expenses, no tax liability, no maintenance obligations. He paused. Second, timing. He handed the judge another document. This agreement is dated March of last year. However, the ink used to sign it did not exist on the market until 6 months later. Seized. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lauren's head snapped up. That's ridiculous. Daniel didn't look at her. Your Honor, he said evenly. We submitted the paper and ink for forensic analysis. The report is included in your packet. The judge read silently. Seconds passed. They felt longer than anything I had ever endured. Finally, she looked up. Miss Carter, she said, addressing Lauren. Did you know this document was examined by experts? Lauren swallowed. I don't see why that matters. The judge's tone remained neutral. It matters because the report indicates the signature does not match Miss Hazel Carter's handwriting with a high degree of certainty. The room went very still. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Lauren turned sharply toward her lawyer. You said this wouldn't be a problem. He said nothing. Daniel continued, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. There's more. He produced another set of documents. Phone records, text messages, emails. Lauren shook her head. This is harassment. Daniel finally looked at her. No, he said quietly. This is context. He turned back to the judge. These records show repeated messages from Miss Lauren Carter to my client after the renovation was completed. Not before. After. He read aloud one message. Now that the house is worth something, we should talk. Lauren's face drained of color. Another message followed. Mom and Dad agree this shouldn't all be yours. The judge exhaled slowly. And finally, Daniel said, there is this. He handed over one last page. A recorded voicemail. Left by the plaintiff. Lauren stood abruptly. That's private. The judge raised her hand. Sit down. Lauren froze, then sank back into her chair. The recording played softly through the courtroom speakers. Lauren's voice filled the room, impatient, irritated, unmistakably real. Hazel, stop pretending this is just yours. You wouldn't even have this house if Grandma had known better. Be smart and sign before this gets ugly. The silence afterward was absolute. No whispering, no shifting, no applause this time. My father stared straight ahead, as if the wall in front of him might open and swallow him whole. My mother's eyes were glossy, unfocused. The judge turned off the recording. She folded her hands. What concerns this court, she said slowly, is not a disagreement between siblings. She looked directly at Lauren. It is the pattern of pressure, the timing of claims, and the apparent attempt to transfer ownership through means that may not be lawful. Lauren opened her mouth. The judge raised a finger. I am not finished. Lauren closed it. The judge turned to me. Miss Hazel Carter, she said. You remained silent while others described you as incapable. Why? The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly. Because I've spent most of my life being told who I am, I said. And I wanted the court to hear who they said I was before hearing the truth. The judge nodded once. Something in her expression shifted, not sympathy, not anger, but recognition. Daniel returned to his seat. Lauren no longer looked confident. She looked exposed. And for the first time since this case began, I realized something powerful. They didn't lose control because I fought harder. They lost control because the truth didn't need my voice to survive. It only needed time. The judge leaned back in her chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on my sister. Miss Lauren Carter, she said calmly, before I issue a ruling, there is one matter I need to address. Lauren straightened, forcing a smile that no longer reached her eyes. Of course, Your Honor. The judge didn't return it. Throughout this hearing, she continued, your legal argument has relied heavily on portraying the defendant as emotionally unstable and incapable of managing property. Yet the evidence presented today suggests something very different. She paused, letting the silence stretch. It suggests preparation, consistency, and restraint. Lauren's jaw tightened. The judge turned to me again. Miss Hazel Carter, she said, I'm going to ask you one final question, and I want you to answer it in your own words. I stood. My legs felt steady beneath me, not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer mattered. Yes, Your Honor. Why? The judge asked. Did you never involve your family in the renovation, the finances, or the management of this house? I took a breath. And this time, I didn't hold back. Because every time I did, I said, my voice clear, they told me I couldn't handle it. Lauren shook her head. That's not true. I didn't look at her. When I bought my first set of materials, I continued, my sister laughed and said I was wasting money. When I worked late nights to pay for repairs, my parents said I was being dramatic. When I said I was tired, they called me fragile. I can't to them take side, my mother whispered. Hazel, I met her eyes for the first time that day. You never asked how I was doing, I said quietly. You only asked when the house would be finished. The room felt heavy, charged. Lauren stood abruptly. This is emotional manipulation. She's twisting things to make herself look like a victim. I turned toward her then. No, I said. You're angry because I didn't fail. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Lauren laughed sharply. You think this is about failure? You wouldn't even have that house if Grandma hadn't made a mistake. The words hung in the air, ugly, undeniable. The judge's expression hardened. Miss Carter, she said to Lauren, you will address the court respectfully. Lauren opened her mouth again, but this time my father stood. Hazel, he said, his voice strained. Why are you doing this? Why are you tearing the family apart? I looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had taught me to stay quiet, to be agreeable, to step aside. I'm not tearing anything apart, I replied. I'm just not holding it together anymore. The judge nodded slowly. That, she said, is a crucial distinction. She turned to the lawyers. I have heard enough. Lauren's confidence finally collapsed. Wait, she said quickly. If Hazel keeps the house, at least order shared oversight. For her own protection. The judge didn't hesitate. There is no legal basis for that request, she said. And frankly, after what I've heard, it would be inappropriate. Lauren's face flushed. You're making a mistake. The judge's voice cooled. No, I am correcting one. It is hafted why. She picked up her pen. In reviewing the evidence, this court finds that the plaintiff has failed to establish any legitimate claim to the Cedar Lane property. Furthermore, the submission of a document that appears to be altered raises serious concerns. Lauren's breath hitched. The court therefore rules, the judge continued, that full ownership of the property remains with the defendant, Miss Hazel Carter. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply stood there, absorbing the weight of the words. And one more thing, the judge added. Lauren looked up sharply. Any further attempts to harass, coerce, or misrepresent ownership of this property may result in additional legal consequences. Silence. My parents sat frozen. Lauren sank back into her chair, staring straight ahead as if the room had tilted. The judge turned to me one last time. Miss Carter, she said, her tone softer now. You showed remarkable composure under pressure. This court recognizes not only your legal right, but your demonstrated responsibility. I nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. As the gavel struck, something inside me finally loosened. Not triumph. Release. I gathered my bag and stepped away from the table. Lauren didn't look at me. My parents didn't follow, and for the first time in my life, I didn't wait for them to. The courtroom emptied faster than I expected. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Papers were gathered. Conversations resumed in low, careful voices, as if everyone was afraid to disturb whatever had just been broken open. A few people glanced at me as they passed, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something closer to understanding. Lauren remained seated. Her shoulders were stiff, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The sister who had walked in, smiling now, looked smaller, contained by the very space she had once tried to control. My parents hesitated near the aisle. My mother took a step toward me, then stopped. Hazel, she said quietly, as if we were alone. We didn't think it would go this far. I looked at her. That's the problem, I replied. You never did. My father cleared his throat. You have to understand, he said, avoiding my eyes. Lauren was just trying to protect the family. I shook my head. No, she was trying to protect her position. Lauren finally stood. So that's it? She snapped, her voice sharp again, desperate to reclaim ground. You win, and we're the villains? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "This was never about winning." She scoffed. Of course it was. I met her gaze, steady. It was about being heard. She laughed once, bitterly. "You could have talked to us." "I tried," I said. "You just didn't listen." The words landed heavier than I expected. Lauren looked away first. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We raised you better than this." I felt something tighten in my chest, then loosen. "You raised me to stay quiet," I said. Today, I chose not to. No one stopped me as I walked toward the doors. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler. Lighter. The courthouse steps stretched out in front of me, solid and ordinary and real. I stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the city wash over me. My lawyer caught up and handed me a folder. "You did well in there," he said. "Not everyone can stay composed under that kind of pressure." "Thank you," I replied. "For believing me." He smiled. "The evidence did the talking, you just gave it space." As he walked away, I realized something important. I wasn't leaving behind a family that loved me and failed. I was leaving behind a version of myself that believed love meant endurance. I descended the steps slowly, deliberately. The house on Cedar Lane was still mine, but more than that, so was my future. And this time, I wasn't walking back into silence. I went to the house on Cedar Lane that evening. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the porch I had repaired with my own hands. The place looked the same as it always had, quiet, modest, solid. But standing there after the ruling, it felt different. Like it finally belonged to the person who had fought for it. Not just legally, but emotionally. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. For a long moment, I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood there, listening to the familiar creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the steady silence I had once mistaken for loneliness. This house had never judged me. It had never told me I was too much or not enough. It had simply stood, waiting for me to claim it fully. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my mother. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, then placed the phone face down on the counter. Not tonight. Some conversations require distance before they can be honest, and some don't need to happen at all. I sat at the kitchen table and let the day replay in my mind. Lauren's certainty cracking, my parents' quiet shock, the judge's steady voice cutting through years of doubt with a single ruling. For so long, I had imagined justice as something loud, confrontational, final. But what I felt now wasn't triumph, it was clarity. I understood something I hadn't before. Standing up for myself didn't make me cruel. It didn't make me ungrateful. It didn't make me a bad daughter or a worse sister. It made me an adult. For years, I had believed that keeping the peace was my responsibility. That if I just stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed agreeable, things would eventually work themselves out. They never do. Peace that requires your silence isn't peace. It's erasure. The court gave me legal protection. That mattered. It set boundaries that could be enforced, consequences that couldn't be ignored. But the real protection came from something quieter the moment I stopped accepting a version of myself that was written by people who benefited from my doubt. I walked through the house, room by room, touching the walls I had painted, the fixtures I had installed, the small details no one else ever noticed. Each one carried a memory of persistence, of learning, of choosing to continue even when no one was watching. When I reached the bedroom, I opened the window and let the evening air in. I thought about the future, not in dramatic terms, not as a victory speech, but as something steady and open. I could rent the house, or keep living in it, or someday sell it and start something new. For the first time, those choices felt like mine. My sister may never admit what she tried to do. My parents may never fully understand why they lost me before they lost the case. But that's no longer something I need to solve. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, carrying with me something far more valuable than a house: my voice, my boundaries, and the certainty that I don't have to be silent to belong anywhere, especially in my own life. That's where my story truly begins.